Well, hello everyone. This is the first of your two videos on Congress. This video is about the institutional structure of Congress. So it's about Congress as an institution. And the second video for this week is mainly about the politics of Congress. So it's a little bit of a division of topics. This video will cover the basics about Congress as an institution, as a legislature. We'll talk about a number of things, including what the legislative function is, how we elect Congress, what its major powers are. We'll talk about how legislation passes, which involves the principles of bicameralism and presentment. And then we'll talk a bit about some of the unique characteristics of the House of Representatives, particularly how the seats are apportioned to the different states. And then we'll talk about the Senate. So Congress is a legislative institution. It is the national legislature of the United States. And of course, there are also 50 state legislatures. Every state has its own legislature. But Congress is the legislature for the entire country. It is what we call a bicameral legislature, which means that it has two houses. Bicameral means two houses. And what's important about that is, as you will learn in more detail, every single piece of legislation that they pass and send to the president has to pass both houses by majority vote with the same language. Not a single word can be different. So the House of Representatives has 435 seats. That's determined by Congress. That they passed a law basically saying they're going to fix the number at 435. They could make it more if they wanted to, or fewer, but it's 435. And the number is fixed at 435, but those 435 people or seats are reallocated after each census based on the number of people who are in each state. So after the 2020 census, there's a reallocation of seats to the states that grew and the states that lost population. Members of the House have a 2-year term. That is, every 2 years they have to run for re-election. Whereas the Senate, there are 2 members from each state, so there are just 100 senators. 435 in the House, 100 in the Senate. And all states are equal. Every state has 2 seats. In the original Constitution, senators were chosen by state legislatures. You may remember we discussed this. Since 1913, in the 17th Amendment, they have been directly elected by the people. So that's an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The senators serve 6-year terms, and they are in 3 different classes, so that 1/3 of them run every 2 years. So every 2 years, all 435 members of the House and 1/3 of the senators are on the ballot for re-election. Now, the word Congress is actually derived from a Latin word, which, as I understand it, simply means a meeting. The original, I guess you'd call it, predecessor to the U.S. Congress was the Congress of the Confederation. That's when we had the Articles of Confederation. And before that, the Continental Congress, which we talked about in the context of the Revolutionary War. And before that, there were colonial assemblies in all the colonies. The idea at the founding of our country was that the country should be governed by the legislative branch. Legislative power was especially important at that time. This is a historical thing that grew out of the British experience, because the United Kingdom, or Great Britain, was ruled by a monarch, as I'm sure you know, and Parliament struggled with the king over a period of centuries to try to assert the powers of what we now know to have been a growing middle class, basically a merchant class that came into existence. And their power was in the Parliament. And they fought to make the Parliament more important. They struggled against the unitary power of the king. And they succeeded over time. But when our country was founded, we never wanted a king. And so the logical way to look at politics at that time was to have a country governed by the legislature. And this is, interesting because in the current context, we once again start looking to the chief executive, in this case the president, to decide what to do. But just understand, at the time of the founding, the notion was that the government should really be have its course determined by what Congress wanted to do. So Congress was really the first and most important of our governing institutions. Now, that has changed, and we're going to talk about that, but just understand that's the way it was originally intended. And you can see that because when the Constitution starts off in Article 1, it starts off with the powers of the legislative branch. Congress comes first in the Constitution. And then it explains that the legislative power belongs to Congress. Legislation, the legislative power means the power to make laws. And that is what Congress does. It makes our laws. In other words, Congress creates the rules that we live by and, as a nation. Now, each Congress has a number, and it lasts for 2 years with 2 one-year sessions. So each session starts on January 3rd and adjourns in the fall, and they take recesses in between. So the first Congress started in 1789, and so, for example, the 117th Congress started on January 3rd, 2021. In a typical 2-year Congress, about 10,000 bills might be introduced in both houses, but maybe only about 600 of them will be ultimately signed into law by the president. So there we have it again, just so, because you can expect that I'll be asking you about this. Senate, 6-year terms for all senators, but 3 classes, and so 1/3 of them run every 2 years in these sort of staggered terms. The House, 2-year terms. What does that mean? Every 2 years we have an election. Every 4 years the president is on the ballot, but we have congressional elections every 2 years. And 1/3 of the senators and all the members of the House will be on each ballot every 2 years. Another increasingly important fact, given the politics of our country, is the way elections are set up. It says in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 4, that the times, places, and manners of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. So the Constitution says that federal elections are determined largely in terms of time, place, and manner in the states and by the state legislatures. But then it says, but Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations. So initially, elections were handed over to the states to run federal elections. But Congress has the express power in the Constitution to step in and overrule what the states do and require the states to follow federal election rules. And this, of course, becomes a subject of controversy because sometimes states want to do things their own way. In the past, for example, in many states, particularly states in the South, they wanted to run elections in such a way as to deny the African American population the right or the ability to vote. And federal legislation put a stop to that, at least for a long time. Some of that legislation has now been reversed by the U.S. Supreme Court, but there still is, the Congress still has the power to pass legislation forcing states to expand access to the ballot, expand polling places, and to not discriminate in the running of elections to favor certain people or parties. What does it take to serve? Well, in case you're thinking of running, to be a member of the House, you have to be 25 years old and a citizen for at least 7 years, and you must live in the state you want to represent. Note, you don't have to live in the congressional district you want to represent. And there have been many situations where a district, a congressional district, the voters in the district have elected someone to be their representative who doesn't even live in their district. It doesn't happen very often, but it has happened. And they don't have to continue to live there, but they do have to live in the state where that district is. Now, senators have to be 30 years old and a citizen for at least 9 years and also have to live in the state. So those are pretty light qualifications, and that's all the Constitution really requires. Now, one key point that is the difference between the United States and a parliamentary system, we have what's called a presidential system. And, that means that the president is elected separately by the voters. has a direct relationship with the voters, runs for election or re-election directly. Now, of course, you know we have this thing called the Electoral College. And so our election really isn't as direct as it sounds. We actually have kind of an indirect system. But understand, Congress does not elect the president in our system. Whereas in a parliamentary system like they have in the UK and a number of other nations, the prime minister, the chief executive, is chosen by the legislature, by the parliament, from among their own members, and is responsible to them. So in the UK, the prime minister can be removed by the legislature just by a vote of no confidence. Now in our system, of course, it is true that presidents can be removed by impeachment, but that is an extraordinary remedy. So, what this means for us is that in a parliamentary system, you usually have strong political parties because they actually have the power not only to legislate, but they choose the executive. Whereas in a presidential system, the parties may not necessarily be that strong. And the Congress itself, the legislature, has a bit less power. On the other hand, in our system, our Congress really does have some significant powers. Congress has the power to make laws. As I said, that's the legislative power. But as part of that, they have an implied power to conduct investigations. And this is very important. Investigations by Congress have involved organized crime, the so-called un-American activities, or fear of foreign threat to our system. And they have involved investigations of presidents. And so presidents can actually be undermined by congressional investigation. They also conduct oversight of executive branch agencies. When we talk about bureaucracy, you'll see what I mean by that. Congress can oversee the agencies that are in the executive branch under the president's control. They also have the power, very important power, not just to make laws, but to raise and spend revenue, the taxing and spending power. Those are the powers of Congress. You can see these are incredibly important functions. They can impeach executive and judicial officers, and you'll find most of their powers in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which we have actually talked about a bit already. But they also have other powers. The Necessary and Proper Clause, which is part of Article 1, Section 8, says that they also have additional power that they might use in furtherance of the enumerated powers. So, for example, if it says that Congress has the power to tax, then it is also implied that they might have the other powers necessary for the power to tax, such as the power to make it a crime to not pay your taxes, the power to arrest you, etc. Or, as I indicated, that they have the power to investigate. That's an implied power that is necessary and proper to carry into effect their ability to legislate. So the U.S. Congress is to some extent unusual in this sense. There are many legislatures that can basically just ratify what the executive branch wants to do. And there are also many legislatures around the world that can block what the executive branch wants to do. But the way our Congress is set up, each individual member, without approval of anybody, can just draft a bill and walk down and introduce it. I mean, every single member of either house, all 535 of them, can introduce a piece of legislation and start it. And it has to at least be looked at. And so that's unusual. Most legislatures around the world, individual members of those legislatures don't have that power to just introduce legislation on their own. And they also have a lot of resources. Every single member of the House and Senate has an office. They have an office in their district. They have an office in Washington, D.C., and they have staffs of maybe 40, 50 people. They have a lot of people working for them, and that enables them to really do a lot of research, a lot of work, a lot of connection with their constituencies, a lot of fundraising. Particularly members of the House are constantly raising money because they have to run every 2 years. And this is the point. Congress was intended to be the primary policy-making institution of the country. And that's why, those powers that we talked about in Article 1, Section 8, those are the powers of the national government, yes, but they are described as the powers of Congress. But, as we kind of foreshadowing what we're going to talk about when we discuss the politics in the next video and when we talk about the presidency, as a reality, just a political fact of life, the presidency has gradually become the major institution of governance in this country. We all look to the president. What's the president going to do? What legislation is the president going to propose? Well, think about it. The president is the one who's supposed to execute the laws, not make the laws. So why do we look to the president for legislation? It's an odd thing, but it has happened, and we're going to talk about how that happened. But preview of this, at least just three things. One, Congress delegated, or essentially gave away, many of its powers to the executive branch, to these big agencies. When they created these big agencies in the executive branch, like the Environmental Protection Agency, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Department of Education, the Department of Commerce, and on, they created those. Congress created those agencies, and they gave them power to do things. And those agencies are ultimately controlled by the president. They are overseen by Congress, but they're really directed by the president. And so they really gave away a lot of their direct rulemaking power, and so many of the agencies of the federal government can make rules, as you will learn, and those rules are very much like legislation. So in a sense, Congress gave away some of its power. That leads constituencies to look to executive agencies rather than Congress when they want something done. And if executive branch agencies are making the rules, then often that's where the interest groups look. Another thing is that the rise of media has empowered the president, because the president has one voice, and if they know how to use it, they can be very effective on the radio, on TV, on social media, Twitter, etc. Because they can project a unified message and a unified vision for what they want to accomplish. Whereas Congress is 535 people, and they have a very hard time. Then two parties fighting with each other. Congress can't really speak well as a single institution. The president can. And lastly, the U.S. has become, throughout the 20th century and into the 21st, a very important nation in world affairs. Well, whose job is that? As you'll learn, that's the president's job. Foreign policy is mainly the president's job. When the Constitution was written, the U.S. didn't matter much in the world of power politics. Now we do. And so the president took on that power and therefore has a lot of influence. Let's talk a bit about where legislation comes from and how it passes. There's a diagram. You've probably seen it before coming, but let's hit some of the key points. Legislation is introduced in one house, could be the House or the Senate. Normally it would be referred to the committee system, right, into a committee, whichever house it's in, where they hold hearings. Most bills die in committee. But then it goes over to, if it passes committee, if it gets through the committee and doesn't just languish and die there, it goes, is voted out of committee to the floor of that house, whether it be the House or a Senate. And then if it does that, it'll probably pass. Then it goes over to the other house. You repeat the same process. It's referred to committee. If it survives the committee process, it gets voted on by the floor, all the members of that house. Boom. Then now we usually have two different bills. One passed the House, one passed the Senate, and they're a little bit different. This would be two bills that are supposed to be about the same thing. So then it goes to what they call a conference committee, which has members from the House and the Senate. They reconcile all the wording and get it down to one version that then goes to both houses and ideally passes both houses in that exact form as prepared by the conference committee. Then we call that bicameralism, both houses. Then it goes to the president for a signature or veto. Only about 3% of bills are vetoed, and the president has 10 days to veto it, or it becomes law. Because if the president doesn't veto it, it will become law in 10 days. Normally the president will sign it. Even if they don't sign it, if they let it sit there for more than 10 days, it becomes law. If it is vetoed, then it goes back to both houses, and it can be passed over the president's veto by a vote of 2/3 in both houses. Only about 4% of vetoes are overridden by Congress. And here you have the diagram, the famous diagram that shows how it works. This shows a bill originating in the House. It could just as easily have originated in the Senate, but the point is it goes through both houses, winds its way around to the president. So now let's talk a bit about this two houses business. Yeah, if you look at this, you can see the blue and the gold here. The blue countries are the ones that have two houses in the legislature, and the orange ones are the countries that have a unicameral or one house legislature. A lot of countries, especially big countries, have two houses, and usually they're based on two different principles, and that's the way ours is. And again, there's a bit of repetition here, but I'm going to go into a little more of the details about this, why we have two houses. There are a number of differences between the two houses, and partly they flow from the size. The House has so many people in it that it has to have a lot of strict rules of procedure. Debate in the House is very strictly controlled by the leaders of the two parties. And what that means is that it's hard to get, if you're a member of the House of Representatives, it's hard to get time to speak. Now, at the end of the day, if you ever watch C-SPAN or something late at night, you can see people talking away into the wee small hours. Well, that's after the day's business is recessed. These are just people talking, for the sake of the TV camera. But debate on bills is strictly controlled, and members get, a minute here, 2 minutes there, 20 seconds, 2 minutes or something. Well, the Senate's very different. They have unlimited debate, and they only have 100 of them. And because they only have 100 of them, they can afford, at least historically, they've been able to afford unlimited debate, where they let senators talk as long as they want. This is what leads to the thing we call the filibuster. And the filibuster is where they take advantage of the idea of unlimited debate and won't stop talking. And if they don't stop talking, if the debate continues, they can't vote. And so filibuster prevents a vote on a bill. Now, the way to stop a filibuster under Senate rules is called cloture. That means 60 of the 100 vote to stop the debate. This is just a Senate rule. They don't have to do it. This is not in the Constitution. The filibuster is a Senate rule. They can do away with it if they want to. But those are some of the key differences. Now, why did we end up like this? Well, originally at the convention, there was a Virginia plan and a New Jersey plan. The Virginia plan was to have two houses, but both of them would have been apportioned according to population. And this is, in other words, the more higher population a state had, the more seats it would have. But that would have been in both houses. The New Jersey plan said, no, we just have one house, and each state will have one vote. One legislative house. Well, the compromise is what we have. One house based, the Connecticut Compromise, one house based on population, one house where all the states are equal. And so that's what we have. We have a Senate where all the states are equal, everyone has two. And we have a House where the more people you have, the more representatives you have. And they have their own special functions. They're not exactly the same. In the House, for example, that's where all spending bills must originate. All bills to spend the money of the United States, they have to originate in the House of Representatives. They also have a very important function of, if the Electoral College cannot choose the president by, in other words, if there's no majority, and of course we're going to cover all this, but if there's no majority in the, so no one gets 270 electoral votes, the House of Representatives chooses the president. And they do that with one vote per state delegation. So each state delegation would have to decide how to cast its one vote. They also have impeachment trials. And you probably know this because, we've had them recently. But we don't just impeach presidents. You can impeach judges as well. And there have been many judges who have been impeached. But the investigation and the initial trial of the impeachment are in the House of Representatives. The vote to impeach is like the accusation, and then it's like a grand jury indictment, and the Senate has what we would call a trial. It's not actually a trial, but we do call them trials. So Basically, the formal accusation is in the House, the trial is in the Senate. So impeachment is divided between the two houses. Also, the Senate votes to approve presidential appointments and treaties. They approve nominations to be judges, to be ambassadors, to be secretaries of state, and that sort of thing. And they also vote on treaties. And then in the case of the deadlocked electoral college, they choose the vice president. So they have certain special functions. Now, of course, in legislation, we've talked about the fact that they both have to work in legislation in much the same way, but they do have these little special duties. And for our purposes, some of the most important would be their role in choosing a president if the electoral college deadlocks and the vice president, the creation of spending bills, and in the case of impeachment, the divided duties where the House makes the formal accusation that we call impeachment, and then the Senate has the trial. So let's talk a bit about the House. I've got pictures coming up here. This is the picture of the House chambers. And this is a really big room, and that is capable actually of holding not just the House members, but the Senate members as well. If they all get together for the State of the Union address, that's where they'd be. Now, you'll see a picture later on of the Senate chambers, which are smaller because they don't have to hold as many people. But they're really quite beautiful old rooms. Each House member will typically be on two of the so-called standing committees. And I've got them listed here. There are basically 21 standing committees, and then there are some other committees as well. I don't expect you to memorize this, but just understand, just take a look at this, and you can see that the members of the House, the committees that they belong to, can cover almost everything that the national government does. I mean, everything: agriculture, armed services, veterans affairs, government oversight and reform, science and technology, everything. And so members of the House will typically be on at least two of these committees. And then those committees have within them subcommittees. And so normally they'll be on 4 subcommittees as well. So what point being? This is a lot of work. They are potentially doing a lot of work. And then we talked about the conference committees. When they try to reconcile legislation, they could be on additional committees as well. So potentially they can be very, very busy if they are on committees. Key thing to understand about the House is apportionment and reapportionment. You may have heard the term gerrymandering. That is a picture of the political cartoon that gave birth to the term gerrymander. It's a caricature of a district that was drawn, a legislative district that was drawn, and the cartoonist said this looks like a salamander, and he called it a gerrymander after a man named Jerry, who was one of the politicians involved. So you can see a bunch of counties put together in a weird, a sort of semicircular way, and this is kind of a whimsical way of rendering it. So it looks like some sort of mythical creature that he called a gerrymander. That's where the term gerrymandering comes from. What it means is drawing legislative districts in such a way that the legislator is choosing their constituents instead of the constituents choosing the legislature. So it's basically like if I'm the legislature, we get to draw our districts so that we get reelected, or that certain types of people get elected, Republicans or Democrats, as opposed to just randomly, or having a computer or a commission draw neutral districts. They give everybody a chance. Now, redistricting is an interesting problem. It is required, as mandatory under our constitutional law, that the districts must be redrawn after every census. And the Supreme Court made that decision back in the 1960s in a series of cases, one of which was Westbury versus Sanders. Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution says that representatives have to be chosen by the people of the several states and apportioned according to their respective numbers. And the Supreme Court said that means you have to have, everyone's vote has to be approximately equal. One person's vote is to be worth as much as another in the House of Representatives. So that means they have to have approximately, very closely, the same number of people in each district. And they have to do that every 10 years. So the districts have to be the same size. But here's the thing. First, every state gets at least one member of the House. So there's no such thing as not having enough to have even one. But the next issue is, where do you draw those lines? And this is where that gerrymander came from. 1812, Governor Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts signed a bill that gave his party an advantage over the other party. And that one district I showed you was compared to a salamander, and someone else said, no, let's call it a gerrymander, and that's where that cartoon came from. There's a particular type, there's two different kinds of gerrymandering that we are concerned about in this country. One is partisan gerrymandering, and that is where the party, one party or another has usually got more power than the other at the time we draw the districts, right? And that party will draw the districts to give themselves even more advantage. And that is called partisan gerrymandering. That is not necessarily a violation of the U.S. Constitution. Many people feel it should be, but the current Supreme Court has decided basically they're not going to block it. Because they say they don't really have a rule to use to decide how the district should be drawn. Now, this is really controversial because it is possible to draw these lines in such a way that you're not just giving yourself a partisan advantage, but you're taking certain groups of voters and reducing their influence. And if the issue is race, that creates a special problem. That is called racial gerrymandering, where you try to help your party by reducing the influence of minoritized groups of voters, typically African American voters. Often this has been done with Hispanic or Latinx voters as well. To try to, and what is done here, the two practices that are at stake here are sometimes called packing and cracking. What that means is you draw the lines so that, for example, you take huge numbers of, let's take African American voters as an example. You create districts that are 90 or 95% African American, but you have a lot of districts that are, let's say, 51% white. Well, if you do it that way, you can end up with the group that just has a sufficient majority winning a lot more seats than the ones who have been packed into huge groups. So if you basically concentrate, in this case, African American voters into the smallest number of districts possible and draw lines that spread out the white voters so they have like 51, 52, 53% in many different districts. And so they can get disproportionate numbers of districts that are where the white voters are the majority. And the black voters might find themselves concentrated in a small number of districts. That is called racial gerrymandering. That is potentially unconstitutional because it could be seen as violating the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Race can be taken into account, but it cannot be the predominant factor. Again, many people feel that this type of that we should have much stricter rules against racial gerrymandering and against partisan gerrymandering. This is one of the districts. It's an example in the Shaw versus Reno case. You can see this crazy district that they view. That's a district that they drew, and it was a problem because of the way they drew the district to create white districts and black districts, and the largest number of white districts possible and the smallest number of black districts. Now, I'm going to show you what happens after the census. This is the number of districts that each state had, the number of members of Congress that each state had after the 2010 census and after it was redrawn. And you can see what happened. The orange states lost a representative or two. The blue states gained a representative or two. You see the Sun Belt gaining. And the gray ones stayed the same. So Illinois lost a seat, and other states gained. Texas, Florida, Arizona, Nevada, etc. Utah. But now look what's happening. Now, after the 2020 census, we know that there are going to be some more changes. The gray states will have no change. The yellow ones will lose a seat. The pale blue will gain one seat, and one state, in this case Texas, is gaining 2. So Illinois is losing a seat. And so it's the same pattern last time. The Rust Belt, Northeast particularly, tends to lose seats gradually in the House and have fewer, smaller delegations. Illinois used to be like 20, then they go down to 18, then they go down to 17. And then states in the Sun Belt have tended, particularly Florida and Texas, have tended to gain seats. But that's what happens after every 10 years. So now let's take the Senate. See how much smaller the Senate is? It's a beautiful old room. Interesting arrangement. The way it's set up, the Vice President is viewed as essentially presiding over the Senate. And the Vice President votes to break ties. If it's 50-50, then the Vice President casts the deciding vote. But as a general rule, the Senate is presided over by actual member of the Senate, the President pro tem or pro tempore. And then there'll be a majority leader for the party that has the most seats, and the minority leader, and then they'll have assistants. So it's very interesting when something happens and the Vice President has to preside and break ties. That actually does occur occasionally. Senate committees, typically senators will be on 4 committees. And again, you see a huge array of committees. Don't try to memorize these, but just look at this and see this wide array of committees that cover basically all the functions of the national government. So they'll typically be on 4 committees and 6 subcommittees, and then they could find themselves on conference committees as well. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time on the issue of how representative the U.S. Senate really is. In the next video, we're going to talk about the whole notion of representation, but look at this. Because every state has 2 senators, but the states all have different populations, the residents of the states with the large populations can essentially be outvoted by the residents of the states with small populations. So the Senate violates that principle we just heard about with the House, that everyone's vote should be of equal weight. Not in the Senate they aren't. And because of the filibuster rule, where they can basically refuse to let something come to a vote, one senator from a tiny state who represents a few 100,000 people can block legislation that is popular with tens of millions of people. So this 2 senators per state principle is part of the U.S. Constitution, and that's the way it is. Although the filibuster is just a rule that the Senate came up with, but understand that this representation problem, this is a real issue. I mean, I can give you a couple of quick examples. We could take states like Alaska, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, and these states that have fewer than 1 million people. Those little small states, you can take 5, 6 of them put together. You've got 12 senators, 14, 18 senators. The bottom 10 states in population, of course, would be 20 senators. Well, think about that for a minute, because, Cook County, Illinois, with millions of people, has more people in it than 5 or 6 of the smallest states combined. They have 12 senators, and Cook County has, a piece of 2 senators. As just one county in one state. But this is part of the way the Constitution was set up. It does create problems in terms of being a representative body. This is as of 2022. You could look at this at any year and see what it looks like. But just to show you the patterns, this is a characteristic pattern. The red states are the ones that have 2 Republican senators. The blue states are the ones that have 2 Democratic senators. The purple have 1 of each. And then we got a couple of areas where you have so-called independents. And that's what, Maine and Vermont, they're actually independent senators. They actually vote with or side normally with the Democrats. But the point being here that a lot of the states are solidly Republican and a lot are solidly Democrat. And if you look at those Republican states, those red states, look how many of them are these tiny little states that have 2 senators and very few people. Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, etc. So something to keep in mind. They don't always have 2 Republican senators, but they tend to be either red or so-called purple states. And that is something that favors the Republicans in terms of controlling the Senate with a relatively small number of people or voters. It also helps Republican candidates in the presidential race, because the way we assign electoral votes to elect the president is we add up the number of senators and members of the House. And so that the same advantage carries over because all the states are equal in terms of the two that are allocated for senators. So that's structure of the institution, and in the next video we're going to talk about what this adds up to in terms of our politics.